It was a damp and desolate spring evening in 1988. The remote coasts of Norway lay hidden beneath low clouds and a veil of light rain. Moisture filled the air, silence covered the earth, and in the sky a familiar hum could be heard. That hum was of 4 turboprop engines. Widerøe Flight 710 was moving towards its destination. It was a Fokker F-28-7, completing its second journey of the day. In the cockpit, the pilots were at ease. According to their calculations, just 8 nautical miles ahead, the clouds would clear and the runway lights would appear. Everything seemed routine. But fate had written something else. Suddenly, a dark shadow rose before the aircraft. Mount Torghatten. One moment, one decision, and then an explosion. The sound of the impact echoed for miles. Flames flickered in the fog for a brief instant. Then the dark night swallowed everything. 36 lives ended in the blink of an eye, and behind them remained only questions. What did that night conceal? Was it the severity of the weather, or a decision in the cockpit that backfired? This is the story of Widerøe Flight 710, a flight that never reached its destination. Stay with us to uncover what really happened in this extraordinary tragedy.
On the evening of May 6, 1988, it was a time when Norway itself was going through a new cultural shift. But at the same moment, Flight 710 took off from Trondheim after a delay of 90 minutes. On board there was everything: families, business travelers, and even a few off-duty airline crew members. They were all heading north, towards Bodø. There were 3 scheduled stops along the way, but the truth was, they would never reach the second one. At 1923 local time, Flight 710 lifted off from Trondheim. The delay had been caused by technical trouble in another aircraft, which had held back Flight 710's departure. Their plan was simple: from Trondheim to Bodø, with short stops at Namsos, Brønnøysund, and Sandnessjøen airports. At the time of takeoff, 52 people were on board. It was a busy flight, but with each stop along the way, the number of passengers would gradually decrease. Widerøe, founded in 1934, was known as Norway's air mail carrier. This was the airline that, even in the storms of winter, delivered letters, carried newborn babies, and flew doctors and food crates into those remote settlements where ferry services had shut down. Its pilots were known for their pride. They used to say, "If the weather is bad, we'll drop below the clouds. We'll find our way by recognizing the familiar mountain peaks, and we'll land even on those tiny runways pressed between sea and mountains." But times were changing. The new -7 aircraft had now arrived, with more modern cockpits and stricter limitations. That day's plane was LN-WFN, Lima November Whiskey Foxtrot November. 8 years old, with more than 16,000 flight hours completed. Just 3 weeks earlier, it had gone through a detailed inspection. No faults had been found. The Pratt & Whitney engines, completely healthy. The avionics, freshly calibrated, and the cabin, fully secure. On paper, everything was perfect, but reality was hidden somewhere else.
That evening, inside the cockpit of Widerøe Flight 710, there were 2 pilots seated. The captain, 58 years old, with 20,000 hours of experience. He knew every detail of his -7 aircraft, but he had only recently returned to duty after a long 6-week leave. Beside him was the first officer, only 31 years old, but with 6,500 flying hours. On the -7, however, he had not even completed 90 hours. Most of his time had been spent flying Widerøe's smaller Twin Otters. In the cabin, there was only one flight attendant, and in the cockpit, a passenger had been allowed to sit on the jump seat. At that time, this was a normal practice, but this normal would soon turn deadly. The second leg of the flight, from Trondheim to Namsos. Only a 20-minute journey. The aircraft landed safely. 16 passengers disembarked, and empty seats appeared in the cabin. But the passenger on the jump seat refused to leave the cockpit. At 20:07, Flight 710 took off again, heading northwest, cleared to flight level 90. The cockpit was calm, the captain at the controls, the first officer on the radio, and the passenger asking question after question. Torque settings, fuel burn, engineering. The captain, in good spirits, kept answering, while the first officer remained silent, focused only on the radio. But this short leg gave them little time. Within just 15 minutes, the aircraft was already preparing for descent. The beginning of descent. At 2020, the aircraft started down. The controller's voice crackled on the radio. Runway 22, wind from the southeast at 5 knots, light rain, visibility 5 nautical miles. Everything seemed normal. But then, a mistake was made. The captain chose his own local shortcut for descent, a method that did not exist on the official charts. Using Torghatten Mountain as his reference, he began descending directly. But in the clouds, the ground was invisible. This was the moment when reliance on instruments was critical. Yet the captain was attempting a visual descent. Dangerously low. After 2027, the aircraft had dropped to 1,600 feet. According to the charts, they should have been no lower than 2,460 feet. The captain ordered, "Gear down, flaps." The landing preparations began. But the ground was now dangerously close. And at that very moment, the passenger in the jump seat began asking questions again. The crew's attention shifted. No one noticed that the aircraft had sunk to just 560 feet, while the runway was still 8 nautical miles away.
At 2028, the passenger resumed conversation. The captain responded and gave the final instructions. Flaps 25, props full fine. The pre-landing checklist was complete. Everything seemed normal. No one realized the aircraft was only seconds away from the ground. Then suddenly, the ground proximity warning system screamed, "Minimum, minimum." Alarms went off in the cockpit. The engines roared louder, the nose pitched up. And through the clouds appeared a dark wall, Mount Torghatten. At 20:29 and 30 seconds, the right wing of the Dash 7 struck the mountain. In an instant, the entire aircraft shattered against the rocks. Within moments, 36 lives were lost. Flames wrapped in fog, then darkness fell. This is not just the story of a crash. It is the story of a moment when a small distraction drove an entire aircraft into a mountain. Immediately after the crash, emergency calls were made. Fire trucks raced into the night, their blue lights flickering across the wet fields. A Royal Norwegian Air Force Sea King helicopter was dispatched, but strong winds and low clouds forced it back again and again. It circled all night, but never reached the mountain. Meanwhile, local volunteers climbed narrow, rough trails, carrying flashlights in search of the wreckage. Near midnight, they reached the slopes of Torghatten, where the aircraft lay destroyed. At 23:30, authorities announced there were no survivors. Morning came, but fog still clung around the mountain. Amid the whiteness, a black scar was visible from afar. Smoke, rising from burnt wreckage, stretched across the mountain like a wound.
The crash site was sealed off. 75 Home Guard soldiers surrounded the mountain. Meanwhile, investigators from the Norwegian Accident Investigation Board set up a temporary lab in a nearby airport hangar. Soon after, both black boxes were recovered. Miraculously, they were intact. When analyzed, the initial data revealed a shocking truth. The aircraft was fully under control. The engines were delivering correct thrust. The autopilot was following the programmed cruise altitude precisely, which meant the plane was going exactly where the pilots were sending it, straight into the rising terrain. But the question was, why did two experienced pilots make this fatal mistake? Why did they begin descent 8 miles before the runway, when procedure required only 4? Interviews revealed a surprising culture. Inside Widerøe's cockpits, informal shortcuts were common. Unnecessary chatter on the radio during approach, sometimes even visitors allowed into the cockpit. Training records uncovered more. Pilots had been converted onto the Dash 7 without simulator training. They learned instrument approaches in the actual aircraft, often in daylight, with reduced risk. Night, fog, and mountains existed only on paper. Charts were flawed. Some beacons were no longer in service, still appeared on the maps. Altitude restrictions were buried in notes, not in diagrams. And it wasn't even clear when the final approach should begin. Investigators also criticized the airline's checklists, which required pilots to monitor a company frequency during descent, exactly when unnecessary communication should have been silenced. In the end, the commission could not pinpoint a single moment of error. But what emerged was a web: loss of attention, ambiguous documentation, informal culture, and weak organizational weakness. In August 1989, the final report was released. The cause listed: unnecessary early descent. Reason: unknown. Alongside, major safety measures were recommended: sterile cockpit rules, clear and accurate charts, increased minimum altitudes in mountainous areas, simulator training, and crew resource management on every flight. Flight 710 was one of 4 fatal Widerøe crashes between 1982 and 1993. And with each tragedy, the airline moved, slowly but surely, toward a modern and safer aviation system.